Ready for joining us right after lunch. We're talking about WYSIWYG, how to unleash the power of Drupal content creation. So for anybody that doesn't know me, my name is Martin Anderson-Clutz. I am a principal solutions engineer at Acquia. I'm also on a podcast called Talking Drupal. A couple of years ago, I was a Starshot track lead for the events recipe. Done a bunch of certifications, and if you ever want to get in touch with me, you can find me as ManClue on a bunch of Drupal and social platforms. So let's start off by talking about what is a Drupal text format. So fundamentally, a Drupal text format can do things like limit what does or doesn't get included in the content that people might provide as input, in terms of particularly things like what HTML tags can be included. Each format can also be associated with a WYSIWYG editor. We'll get into what that is in a moment, as well as how it's configured. A text format will define what filters are in use to modify user input before it gets displayed. And each text format requires permission by user role in terms of who can actually make use of that particular text format. Now, I mentioned WYSIWYG earlier. Does anybody not know what a WYSIWYG is? Well, let's turn it around. Who wants to tell me what is a WYSIWYG?
What you see is what you get.
That's correct. So, got the name because before WYSIWYG editors became so popular, people would actually have to write tags into text formatting tools. So it's this idea of a place where you can go in, you can sort of visually see. In this case, we've got the heading is larger, we've got links that are sort of blue and underlined exactly the way that they will appear in the same page. You can see that in this case the image is sized into the right, and all those things meant to sort of give content creators an accurate representation of how the content will look once the page is published. So definitely an improvement over having to sort of see and work with tags as you did before. Typically, a WYSIWYG will include a toolbar with buttons like you see at the top, as well as, which are often buttons, but sometimes can be other widgets like drop-downs and so on. It often will include, or can include, an option to edit the underlying code, and it's worth mentioning that by default, Drupal uses CKEditor 5, which is a project used much more broadly than just on Drupal. But you can also use other ones, and we'll get into at least one other option as we go through. So here's an example. If you were to use the source button on this particular WYSIWYG, you can see that even though it's presenting to the user sort of a visual layout, under the hood it actually is mapping that to tags. And it's also worth pointing out that you can see that even within this tag, it's not straight HTML. There's some Drupalisms in here, like data entity type that would be sort of standard HTML, and we'll see how that actually ends up in the publish page in a moment. So if you were to publish that page, it would look something like this. So you can see it's pretty similar to what we saw in the WYSIWYG. Not 100% the same. We'll talk a little later about how to correct for things like that. But here's the actual rendered HTML that gets sent to the browser. So if we look at this, we can see that there are some differences between what's here and actually what was in the WYSIWYG. So again, some of these things that we saw as Drupalisms in here actually get converted on output to the browser into sort of expanded markup to make sure that it's going to reproduce properly across different browsers. And that's part of the power of some of the processing capabilities that are built into text formats that we'll talk about. So that's a fair bit of talk. Let's actually get hands-on and see an example of how some of these work and why you should be careful about which text format that you use. So one of the things that we see a lot is teams might collaborate outside of Drupal or your CMS in some other tool to sort of get copy approved. So in this case, let's suppose that the team had collaborated on this Google Doc, and you can see that as it got passed around, people might copy and paste from other documents. So you've got some stuff in here that you probably wouldn't really want coming through to your website, so some different fonts, highlighted, different font colors and different things. But we've got some formatting that probably would be useful, right? So we've got links in here, we've got a couple of places with bold text, we've got a table So ideally you would want that, what we call semantic markup, so it's kind of the structural elements to come through, but not necessarily the formatting. You want your website to really be the source of truth for that. So if we go into a Drupal site, so this is a relatively fresh install of Drupal 11.3, and we paste that in here. This is the default sort of basic HTML text format. We can see that it's done a decent job. So we've got heading at the top, we've got the links preserved, we've got a spot here where we've got our bold text preserved, and it's taken out some of those other things, right? So the font colors and wonky fonts and some of those other things. But our table hasn't rendered, because that's actually one of the things that the basic HTML text format doesn't allow. So we can try doing the same thing with some of the other default text formats that are provided. So in this case, let's switch it to restricted HTML. And we can see here, based on the sort of documentation that appears below, that it's really meant to be sort of manually coded. So there's no WYSIWYG in this case. It's really meant to be sort of a manual text editor. Probably not something you're going to use a lot. But now you can see there's no formatting whatsoever in terms of how that comes through. It really comes through as basically plain text. And if we were to do the same exercise now in full HTML, copy and paste that in again, you can see now we've got our table, which is great, but now it's brought through all of that other formatting, right? So we've got different fonts in here, we've got the highlight, the different font color, and if we actually look at the source, there's a ton of stuff that you would never, as sort of the website owner, want to see actually in your database in terms of all of these inline styles. Stuff copied and pasted from things like Microsoft Word are notorious for having all kinds of garbage markup that's really tough to clean up after the fact. And so actually paying attention to what text formats your users are using, particularly as the defaults, can actually sort of preemptively keep a lot of that clean for you. So again, one of the reasons why it's actually really important to pay attention to your text formats. So, as we've talked about, basic HTML as sort of the default format out of the box with Drupal core is going to allow some HTML tags in, and then it's also going to provide some formatting options around inserting images, how to align certain things, providing captions for images, and a few other things. Restricted HTML, I haven't really used that much, honestly, in sort of production websites. I think it's meant for more like comments and kinds of things where you probably want to allow some tags, but not necessarily provide an actual visual editor for those things. It'll do things like convert URLs and line breaks automatically into sort of their HTML equivalents. Full HTML, as we saw, is basically the definition of a permissive text editor. So it does have sort of all of the visual tools, but it allows everything, and then conversely that has the problem of allowing a lot of sort of probably unintended things to come in, and then plain text will basically escape any tags at all, and so anything that the user puts in will be printed out as plain text. So from a security standpoint, it's actually not bad, but for many users will not be the result that they intended. So some people might look at that demonstration and think, well, if I don't really necessarily understand or want to try and anticipate what kinds of things my users are going to try and put into the content, I should just use full HTML everywhere, right? Well, right. So we already saw that you get that formatting problem in terms of all of the kind of garbage markup that can go into your Drupal content, but you also leave yourself open to security issues. So people can actually put script tags and other kinds of cross-site scripting security problems in there, and so definitely full HTML is something that you want to have very selectively granted in terms of who can actually use that as a text format.
Can you still put in PHP, or is that that's ugly?
What's that?
You used to be able to insert PHP code directly into. Did that get totally taken out?
Yeah. So the PHP filter was moved directly out of core. I think it still exists as a contrib project.
It's a contrib product, yeah.
I don't know if it requires the bad ideas module, but it probably should. Yeah. There is this idea of the principle of least privilege. It's sort of, people who are big on security, this is sort of the most fundamental tenets is don't give people more access than they absolutely need. And certainly because there are security implications for text formats, this is something you should try and adhere to. So for different people that are going to be accessing your CMS and creating content, really try and tailor the experience for exactly the kinds of tools they're going to need access to, and give them those selectively, as opposed to just saying, here, go ahead and use something like the full HTML that we saw. All right, so now let's go through and see what if we wanted to update, in our case, the basic HTML text format to actually allow us to have our table in there. So let's go in and actually edit that within the Drupal configuration. So here's our list of text formats. Again, these are all kind of out of the box with Drupal 11.3. You can go into the configuration screen, and now you can see you have this ability to sort of say, for this particular text format, who are the people that should have access to it. Definitely, I would say it's going to be a pretty rare case where you want to allow anonymous users to put anything that has like HTML in it into your database. Best practice for anonymous users would be like plain text only, I would say, pretty much always. Within here, you have the ability to configure the toolbar. So these are all of the buttons that we saw back on our Create Page button. So let's switch this back to basic HTML, and it's going to complain, but that's fine. So we can see these are the same buttons. The presentation as you're editing them is a little bit different because they're sort of more gray and it's more spaced out. But it's the same buttons, and here's where we determine what buttons are going to be visible and in what order. So in our case, we want to say go ahead and add the table element in here, so that as an editor I can create those tables. We could also do things like add style buttons or take ones out that we don't think, like maybe we don't need to put code snippets to our page. So there's no reason to have that in the actual toolbar. So as we go down here, you can see these are all plugins. So all of the buttons that are in the toolbar basically are supported by Drupal plugins as code. And some of them actually have settings associated with them. So for things like headings, you can choose which ones you want to be available. It's kind of a best practice that within each sort of article that there's only going to be a single H1 heading, and so that's why by default that one is disabled. For source editing, you can allow additional tags to what the rest of the WYSIWYG supports. There's different options in terms of what people can do with things like lists, both ordered and unordered. Where it should save images, maximum file size, those kinds of things, as well as like whether or not users can resize images. And we'll talk a little bit later about how you can add kind of additional plugins that give you the ability to expose additional capabilities, and many of those will have their own additional settings. So if you decide that you want to extend CKEditor, you need to both install the module and then come into a particular text format, come into this interface, drag it into the toolbar, and then configure it before it'll actually be usable for your end users. And below that is the section where you can determine the filters that are going to be in use for this particular text format. And the filters basically, again, do that job of applying different kinds of manipulation or transformation to the text to change it from the input that the user provides into something that is actually HTML that the browser can render. So you can see here, by default, it's going to limit the HTML tags to a set that we'll see below. Display any HTML as plain text is clearly not something that we're going to want enabled for this particular text format, because we want it to actually sort of appear as formatted content as opposed to a bunch of code. So on down the list. Probably not a lot of value in reading out all of these. I will point out that lazy load images is on by default, so that from a performance standpoint, images will only load as you go down the page, which is definitely a performance improvement. You can also, as part of this form, drag and drop to change the filter processing order. Sometimes that can be important. So for example, things around limiting HTML tags or escaping them, sometimes it's important to get the order of those right, but I would say particularly if you're starting with one of the default ones, probably don't rearrange these unless you're absolutely sure that you need to, because out of the box these are typically pretty well thought out. And down below here you can actually see the list of the allowed HTML tags. And it used to be this was a thing that you had to sort of like manually go in and manipulate as you wanted to expose different things. But you can see that when we dragged the table button into the toolbar, it automatically added it here. So table, table row, table cells, and sort of some of the similar or associated tags are automatically added into there. So it's not something we have to sort of manually manage. And we could also do things like add rel equals no follow to all links, kind of an SEO best practice, but for internal content where it's only, let's say, staff members, maybe that's not something you have to worry about. But we can go ahead and save that. And now with that updated, if we go back into here, and let's go ahead and copy our content again. And with our basic page, we've got the basic HTML. Let's refresh so that we've got the latest version. And when we paste that in, now we've got a table. And if we even do things like highlight a cell, we could say make this a header row, and it's going to sort of appropriately add some default formatting to that as well. So hopefully you can see, with just a little bit of effort, we could tweak this default text format to give us sort of the extra capability that we need as appropriate for this particular piece of content, as opposed to going to something that's substantially more permissive in terms of what it allows, with all of the other sort of challenges that can create for us. One other thing that I'll point out here is if we go into our content type definition, so go into basic page, manage fields, and body. On each long text field as part of a content type, you do also have the ability to say, maybe there's only one text format that we want to allow, or you can sort of restrict it down further in terms of which fields can use which text formats, which if we were to go ahead and say only use basic HTML, then when we go to create a basic page, we don't even see the toggle there because we're forcing people to basically use that text format. So again, as the site builder, you have the ability to sort of say, this is the one that should always be used. All right, any questions so far, everybody? Hold along? Good stuff. All right, so hopefully what you can see by now is that some of the ways in which text formats sort of impact the sites or the capabilities that your site exposes to content editors are around what formatting is going to be allowed. So how the input that users provide will actually get processed. So again, changing it into sort of the rendered HTML. There are definitely security implications of which text formats you give users access to and how they're configured. And then also there are capabilities associated with the text formats that you create. And so it can actually be really powerful, some of the things that you can allow people to do within your site as part of the text format that you create. So I like to say that text formats are actually a really effective way that you can empower your content editors. And so let's talk about exactly what that process looks like. So what we're going to talk about today is really focused around Drupal modules and the ability to sort of use, in our case, just a few examples from the thousands of free Drupal modules that you can use to sort of customize the capabilities on your own Drupal website. So going back to that list that we just talked about, there are definitely a variety of ways that you can expand the sort of formatting and markup options that are available. So you can do things like turn the tables into responsive tables so that they work well across different device formats, so mobile, tablet, those kinds of things. I've definitely worked with a couple of different CKEditor plugins around being able to have footnotes within your content, but one that I actually maintain is called Details Accordions, and so of course I'm going to be biased and say we should go ahead and use that. So if we go into our extend page to enable a module, if we go detail, you can select our module and say install. And so now that's been installed, we can go back in our configuration to content authoring, text formats and editors, and that's where we can update our configuration here. And now if we were to go in here and say grab this accordion button and add that into our toolbar. And let's go ahead and save that, because this one doesn't need any settings. Now if we go back to our create basic page, call that, let's just call this our text page. We can drop in a details accordion, and now we can just give it the summary. And now you have the ability, go ahead and save this. And so now we have our details accordion element as part of the page that we created. And so, in just, basically a minute, we've been able to add a new capability in terms of the kinds of content that people can make as part of the pages as well. All right, so in a similar way, we can also add to sort of the processing capabilities of our text format. So token filter is one we're going to get into. Anybody's not familiar with the concept of tokens in Drupal, they're sort of like specially formatted codes that you can use to basically inject dynamic values into your page. And we'll get into, that'll probably make more sense as we sort of look at that particular module. There's a plugin called Entity Embed, which is really powerful because it allows you to inject other pieces of content within your WYSIWYG. So maybe you've got reusable CTA banners that you want to inject within content various places, or testimonials as another example. You can have those as a managed set of content and then put those within the content that's created within your WYSIWYGs. And then the non-breaking space filter allows you to control sort of spacing around things like punctuation and so on, so that they don't sort of wrap across lines in weird ways. So let's go again back into our site here and on the token filter, get that enabled. Go back into our configuration menu. Now you can see we've got this new token browser button, so we can drag that into our toolbar. That does also give us a setting, but we can just leave that for now to allow all of the different tokens to be exposed. And then there is also a filter that we need to enable to get it to work the way that we want. So we'll save that, go in and edit our page again. And maybe what we want to do here is let's add a new paragraph and say, hope you enjoy this. And then we can open up our token browser. And basically, it's going to give us a list of all of the different tokens that are available. So in this case, it could be, say, current page, and we'll say the title of the current page. This could be useful because maybe we know the title of this page is going to change, and we know that we want it to always refer to whatever the title is and not have to remember to update it in more than one place, because it's going to be within the body copy. In this case, maybe we could also say we want it to have a dynamic reference to the kind of content. So we could say no type. There we go. No content type. And so we can see these. So these are what tokens look like. Because we've enabled this token filter as part of our text format, when we go ahead and save this, it's going to render those out as the actual title and content type there. In a single piece of content like this, it may not necessarily be super obvious why these are useful. You could do things like dynamically insert, let's say, the site name for a piece of content that's going to appear across multiple sites in something like a Drupal multi-site install. And that can be a way to make it feel like it's more contextual, even though it's boilerplate and being used multiple places as well. So a simple example of the token menu, or token filter. Then some additional capabilities. There's lots of really powerful ways you can extend the capabilities that you expose to your editors. Particularly using things like AI tools. It wouldn't be a Drupalcamp talk in 2026 if I didn't speak about AI to some degree. Markdown easy. If you have, let's say, a site that wants to have people using Markdown to write content instead of HTML, Markdown easy can be a really easy way to set up, and you can actually then use a specialized Markdown editor instead of CKEditor as the way to sort of provide controls for people to apply formatting. And then there is also a suite called CKEditor Premium Features. It is associated with a subscription that you would have to get, but we'll talk in a minute about some of the pretty interesting capabilities that it provides. So for the AI module, it has its own kind of submodule specifically for CKEditor AI capabilities. So you can do things like, generate either, let's say, the outline of a blog post or the entire first draft of a blog post, whatever is your preference. You could write some content and then modify it. So say, rewrite this to change these features or to, clean up the grammar or different kinds of things that way. You could ask it to reformat the HTML. So maybe you wrote it in bullet form and now you want it in paragraph form. Those are the kinds of things that AI can do for you easily, as well as checking spelling, writing summaries, changing the tones. You can say, maybe I've written something in a very technical way and I want to make that more easy to read. Again, those are the kinds of things that AI can do for you very easily, as well as do things like translate into completely other languages. But of course, I would always get that validated by somebody who's actually a native speaker of that language rather than just trusting that AI has done a capable job anyway. Here's an example of the CKEditor premium features. So real-time collaboration, having inline threaded comments are just some of the capabilities that you have here. So there's a lot of pretty interesting features in here. There is kind of a free version that doesn't have like the real-time collaboration, but does add some things like being able to have like a full screen editor. So if people are going to be writing kind of long form content, that can be kind of useful. So definitely worth looking at, but I would say probably the actual premium version is really something to look at, likely if you're only interested in the real-time collaboration type
How much
features.
does that cost? Out of curiosity.
I have tried to get an answer out of them, but it's very like, call us and we'll talk.
Yeah.
So-
How many people do you want? Do you think
How
they're
often are they
using it?
making edits? Yeah, it's
It's expensive.
yeah, that's the sense I get as well.
Everybody's little,
Yeah.
for sure.
One other thing that we talked about at the beginning is that by default, CKEditor is using the styles in your admin theme, particularly if you're not using your front-end theme as the place where you're creating content. That's the part of the reason why when we saw at the beginning, there were some differences in terms of like the font that was used and sizing and some of those kinds of things in the editor. So in your theme, you do have this ability to actually declare CKEditor style sheets, and then those will actually be passed into CKEditor. So that can be a nice way to sort of help to bridge some of those differences so that what people are seeing as they're creating content in your editor are actually going to be reflected in the editor itself, even though it's using a separate theme. And then within here, the best practice, particularly if you're using sort of generalized selectors, is to prefix them with this special class, CK-content. Because CKEditor 5 doesn't use an iframe the way CKEditor 4 used to, if you just did this as like an H1, it would actually like take over the actual admin theme, basically overwrite it. So if you're using more specialized classes, like the styles that you want to use, like maybe you've got like a lead-in class you want to be able to apply to paragraphs or something, it probably doesn't, it's not as important, but again, for broad selectors like that, definitely want to make sure that you prefix it. So, hopefully in our talk so far, you've been able to get a sense of the sort of powerful ways that both which text formatter you choose as well as how you choose to configure it can have a pretty significant difference in terms of the kind of experience that you're going to create for your content editors. And so I encourage you to all go out and make it a great one. Again, think it through carefully as much as you can, engage with the stakeholders and understand what are the kinds of content they're going to need to manage, and really build it to suit that particular set of needs. But happy to open it up to any questions. Yes?
Can you show how you updated the text format so that it removes the inline styling again?
So that it would do what?
That you remove the inline styling and you copy and paste.
Oh, okay. So let me. So the question was to show again how we updated the text format to remove kind of the garbage inline markup. Okay. So actually, I think probably the easiest thing is for me to just revert back to the state it was at the beginning entirely, which will just take a minute. So the sort of crux of the approach, so there is actually a module called, I think it's like CKEditor paste, that tries to do that as part of a specialized version of like the paste operation itself. But in my experience, it's at least as effective to just do that by making sure that people aren't using a text format that's more permissive than it needs to be, so that it strips it out by default for you. So if we go back into our, let's go back to the content creation page and grab our content again. So if we go back to here and paste that in, let's actually switch it over to full HTML. So the reason that we were seeing the garbage markup is really because we were using the full HTML text format. And let's go paste that in here and then look at the source code. And here's where we have all of the sort of like inline styling that is going to be kind of a nightmare for somebody to clean up after the fact. And if we look at our text formats, it's because if we go into full HTML in the configuration, it does not have this limit allowed HTML tags and correct faulty HTML. So it's basically free range in terms of whatever input comes in, it's going to save to the database and ultimately pass through. It's not doing any of that processing in terms of saying only allow certain things through. And that's where if instead we were to go ahead and switch to our basic HTML and save that, now we can see that, if we go back up, we've got sort of that nice clean markup again.
But also, if we show on the basic HTML format the actual where it's actually stripping the tags,
right,
in the config.
Yes. So okay. So to Mark's point here, we've got on our basic HTML, it does have that checked, and then based on the buttons that we have active, it's going to automatically generate this list of allowed tags, and you can see that this is very restrictive in terms of both which tags can be used as well as which properties they can have. And so there is no, in any of these, style property, which is sort of going back to sort of the garbage markup. Most of that was really style properties within the HTML tags.
And then if you want to add properties or attributes, you can do that there as well. Say if you want to have a class for your H1s or your headers, you would put that in there so the class actually goes through as well.
So for those of us who have been using Drupal a long time, we definitely remember doing that. But if you actually read the text in here for CKEditor 5, it says that this is read-only for CKEditor 5. So,
Oh, is that really?
yeah.
I just swore I edited that one.
Again,
But then you can put that in your config then.
yes. Yeah, exactly. I mean, so, okay, so this is allowed HTML tags. It may be more up, yeah, there's probably a different way to do it. You may even need a separate module for that to enable that as something that's configurable directly as part of the text format. Otherwise, anything that provides specialized buttons for things like tables or accordions like we've seen will actually automatically add those into that list anyway. So, other questions?
Yeah, I got you. So you saying that, or you're saying at the bottom like of that list, like that you can't add to that like directly?
Yeah. So it says here, this is a read-only field.
Is it though?
It is.
So it says-
And I recently
Yeah.
ran into that.
Yeah, actually, I do remember running into that, and having to edit the config of the YAML.
Oh my God.
Right. That's a hardcore way to do it, yeah. But yeah, so it says manually removing tags could break enabled functionality, and any manually added tags would be removed by CKEditor on render. So, price of progress, I guess.
So I got a question.
Yeah.
You had mentioned other WYSIWYG editors. Did I miss you talking about that? Did we go down to that, or did we?
Sort of. So Markdown Easy was kind of the one in my head. That's an alternative WYSIWYG editor. I would call it like WYSIWYG Lite because I feel like Markdown, by its very nature, is meant to be more like you apply the formatting on your keyboard. But if I recall correctly, it does have kind of buttons where if you're like, oh, I want to make an H1, like you click the H1 button, and you have the thing with the the £1 symbol in a space, and then the thing. But it does also sort of reflect that it's like larger and bold and those kinds of things, so that as an editor you see the visual feedback in addition to seeing sort of the like text markup that Markdown is basically, it's the heart of what Markdown is.
What was that other one that we used before we got into CKEditor?
It's Tiny MC.
Tiny
Tiny
MC,
MC,
yeah.
Because like
That's still around?
We used to get nothing.
I don't know if it's still around.
Yeah, I sort of feel like maybe Tiny MCE somehow evolved into CKEditor, but I could be wrong on that.
No, they were
Yeah.
in parallel projects.
Yeah, that could be too.
I don't think Tiny MC is still around.
Any other questions? Yes.
Since you can't edit that list, at least do it through the config, is there any like other limitations to be concerned about if you enable that poster?
Any other limitations to be?
Like anything to consider before you enable that to make sure that like there's nothing else you need to add to that list?
Yeah, I would say it's more a case of if there are certain kinds of tags that you need, then just making sure that either if there are associated buttons, that they're basically moved into the toolbar. I guess the other thing that's worth pointing out here is that you can also force a second row and then have other buttons. I don't know why you would want to have a row of buttons for super and subscript, but you could do that and save that. And then you can have those here so that you can sort of keep prominence, have it or mobile or whatever. But yeah, I feel like the easy or probably the most intuitive way is if there are buttons for those, just make sure that those are in the toolbar. But yeah, there's probably a project that I just don't know off the top of my head that would allow you to sort of force it to add other ones, but there is also the configuration piece. But I would say, like, if you're starting a project, then definitely having a conversation with the people who are going to be creating the content around, like, what are the kinds of markup that you need? Because for most sites that I've worked on, having things like super or subscript are not. But if you were working with like the science faculty of a university, then probably they would want those, right? So again, knowing who the audiences are, what's the kind of content that they're going to want to manage, those are the kinds of things that it would be helpful to sort of tease out during discovery.
So for the media button, does that do like video tags, like with the new HTML, like?
Yeah, I mean, so this is
Or no, that's
actually
just the image?
this is just the image. There is a separate one. This
You have
may
to
not
enable
have.
the media module, which is
Yeah, because this is a bare install, it probably doesn't have the media library enabled yet. But we got a couple minutes. We could go through that exercise. Let's go media library. So go back in here. Now we've got some different buttons. So now instead of the image, we can put in Drupal media. I would say probably don't have both because you'll get people confused. And now if we go back in here,
wait, you have to. enable
Oh, did I?
configuration.
Oh, right, yeah, there's the
Embed.
embed media, yes, thank you. And I think we just leave the defaults for now. And so now we've got to insert media and say remote video. Let's see. Let's just get this. And for that. And so before we save it, it's going to use sort of this special Drupal media tag. And so we can say, demo. And then if we save that, and then inspect this, in terms of the markup, you can see it's using an iframe. So it's basically iframing in the actual YouTube player. In this
Well, right, that's for like a third party versus like.
right, exactly. So the
Yeah.
remote video is going to be different than if we actually uploaded like an MP4 or something like
Right.
that. Yeah. And there are obviously different modules that you can use that will use different sort of rendering strategies for video players and all that kind of stuff too.
Well, and also like if you're uploading a video, like why do you necessarily why would you have it as its own entity or as its own field?
Right, but so I mean, one thing that I have done, I guess, to that point, I will say that I feel like in the Drupalverse we tend to understand this like broad concept of media as like the thing that you go to insert, images and video and audio and all of those things. But for, let's say, a less technically sophisticated audience, often they would rather have separate buttons for, insert image, insert video, insert audio, or whatever the separate things might be, so that it's more explicit. And you can have, instead of this one button that's like a couple of things, you can have like an image button and a video button and, whatever the use cases might be. And that actually is a good example of where the entity embed module can be good for that, because you can actually make a button that will allow the user to choose, a video media entity as the thing to paste in. And so you can actually, again, tailor the experience to be better for that kind of audience if that's something that's going to make their use of the WYSIWYG more intuitive. All right, I think we've got time for one last question, or I can give everybody a minute of your life back. All right, sounds like we're good. Thanks, everyone.